Here we are. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shruti. I'm speaking from occupied Lenape-Hoking, also known as New Jersey. I'm here to welcome all of you, but also Aghilah, Suchitra, and Harsha on behalf of South Asian Americans Leading Together SALT for Earthbound 2, the second event in our mini-series on the intersections between land, labor, and migration, really looking at ways that we can assert our love for the land through our identities as immigrant and migrant communities. And so this specific event, we're gonna have our wonderful guests kind of talk about their own analyses and experiences with labor rights and land rights and climate rights and migrant rights, and how really these movements are so embedded in one another that you can't separate them ever. And having our conversation facilitated today by our board member, Jayeesha, who's calling in from New Orleans, and I'm gonna pass the mic on to her.
Thanks, Shruti, and welcome everybody. Special thanks to our guests for joining us today. My name's Joyce. I go by she, her, hers. I live in Balbancha, also known as New Orleans, stolen lands of the Biloxi, Chitimacha, Choctaw, Takapa, Isha, Homa, and others. I'm on the board of SALT. I'm also on the board of the Climate Justice Alliance, Alternate Routes, Eyewitness Palestine, and I collaborate with the Wind Call Institute, and I'm a core founding member of another Gulf is Possible collaborative. So many hats, and all of these hats relate to the conversation at hand today, and I'm super excited about it. I welcome y'all to put your name, pronouns, organization, location into the chat as I pass it to our amazing guests to introduce themselves. And we'll start with Aghilah.
Hello everyone, my name is Aghilah Nadaraj. I use she, their pronouns, and I'm calling in from Indianapolis, Indiana, which is occupied Miami territories, and also been the homes to the Shawnee, Potawatomi, and Delaware nations. And I also, along with Joycia, serve on the Climate Justice Alliance board representing the Kepler Institute, which is a local nonprofit grassroots organization in Indianapolis. I'm also a youth leader and have been with the organization for about 5 years, and I'll go into my work a little bit later. But thank you, and I'll go ahead and pass it to Suchitra.
Thank you, Aghilah. Thank you, SALT. Before I introduce myself, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking from the ancestral Lenape homelands, and also acknowledge that New York is home to one of the largest urban populations. And it's important for us to continue to speak about these issues. I'm a lawyer, writer, and a researcher. And I'm the founder and executive director of the Polis Project. We are a New York-based hybrid research and in-depth journalism organization. And I'm today glad to be in conversation with Aghilah and Harsha, passing it on to Harsha.
Thank you all. It's such an honor to be here, and thank you, SALT folks, for organizing. And I very much appreciate the shout outs to CJA. CJA does incredible work. My name is Harsha Walia. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm based on the occupied traditional homelands of the Coast Salish peoples. These are the lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. And I think it's important, particularly for those of us doing this work, as I'm sure we'd all agree, to not simply acknowledge territories, but understand that these jurisdictions and laws are alive, that Indigenous nations whose lands we're on means that we have a continued responsibility to understand and think through our complicities with respect to settler colonialism and land here on these territories, and also to think about it in the context of diaspora, right? Like, what does it mean for our relationship to Adivasi communities in homelands that we may call home, or where we also have home? So to think about colonization as it exists in multiple locations, and not only in the context of the diaspora, where I think sometimes we become limited. And also I want to situate a little bit this conversation for me as a live conversation right now, as our Sikh elders continue to occupy and continue to be protesting around the Delhi borders, right? And that is continuing now for almost past 6 months. And what that means for those of us who come from farming backgrounds, what it means to relations to the land, to food sovereignty, to communalism and freedom and more. And so I welcome this conversation for myself within those contexts. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks y'all. And so for the first question is for all of you. And I'm gonna put it in the chat too, in case you're a visual learner and reader. So what are some practice of care for the lands and waters that you come from and live on now? And how do you see the reciprocal and regenerative relationships modeled, like in the work that you do? And anyone can really start. And
I'll jump in. I'd say the lands that I'm on right now, unceded Coast Salish territories and the 3 nations who steward these lands. I mean, there's many practices, all of which are rooted in different iterations of Indigenous laws. Perhaps one of the most visible struggle ongoing is struggle for the water. So Vancouver here in the Pacific Northwest is an island. And so all the host nations have a deep relationship modeled through canoe journeys that are very much based in reciprocity to waters, including land. And, you know, all of the food sovereignty is very much reliant on water, including salmon. And one of the very live struggles that calls on all of us to participate and take action is the struggle against pipelines that are being built on these territories. And one of the declarations that a number of Indigenous nations have passed over many years is a declaration against Enbridge Pipeline, the declaration against Kinder Morgan, and a number of other pipelines, which importantly is not only a refusal of pipelines, but also explicitly an affirmation of Indigenous law, right? So it's not just an environmental stand against pipeline and resource extraction, but it's also a declaration of free, prior, and informed consent that is required, that is required under Indigenous laws and for governments and corporations to operate on these territories. And so I think that is some of the practices of care. I think blockades on these territories are also practices of care. There are also care-based economies. And so I think, many forms of resistance and refusal are practices of care. In addition to, I don't want to speak too much about them because, many of them really are quite sacred, and I don't want to speak on behalf of, but just to say that many of the ceremonies that I've been invited to participate in are very much also practices of care and very much about relationship to land and water and our responsibilities and reciprocities, including those of us who are non-Indigenous and settlers, right? That once we come to live on these lands, that we have a responsibility to those nations and to the lands and waters that we live on.
thanks, Harsha. Aghilah or Suchitra? Do you want to respond to this one?
Aghilah, do you want me to go, or would you like to go first?
Oh, no, it's okay. You can go ahead.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that, Harsha. I was thinking of reflecting on my home, where I came from. I'm an immigrant to this country, and there's something that Harsha points out as well. What is our relationship to these lands that we now come as immigrants, and what care and what responsibility and culpabilities that we hold? But I want to take a minute to understand my own background. I come from, both my parents come from farming backgrounds, which means that the very idea of the privilege of someone like me, the privilege that I have, comes from the fact that my ancestors held a certain plot of land. By the act of owning that land, as caste Hindus, they were also responsible for other people's landlessness. And I think that is something that's very, very important for us to acknowledge. And also, if you go back, and I think one of the things that I had to do is to also go back and understand what that means to India today, but also means to places in South Asia where caste is so, it permeates not only our life, but affects every aspect of our life. And that also takes us back to Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's life and writing, where he's one of the first people, while Phule talks about this in the 19th century, he was one of the first people to very specifically talk about the relationship between caste and land, and how even the language of land reform actually does not really help us understand what retribution, what kind of ways in which the years of oppression can be not only dismantled, but what ways can we then redistribute. There's also a problem with the word redistribute, because it is not about redistribution, it is about returning what the land means to people and how do we think about this. And one of the interesting things that I was trying to understand how caste, land, and village society existed in pre-colonial India and colonial India, but also a post-colonial India in which the penal colony continues to exist. This weekend, I was listening into a webinar conducted by the family members of the BK-16 political prisoners, and Hani Babu's wife, one of the political prisoners, said that India is still a caste colony. And I think a caste colony then continues to not only inform our relationship to land, but it also informs the immense privilege that a very small section of the community continues to accrue year over year, which means that some of our privileges is inherently linked to deprivation of other people's rights, choices, and opportunities. And as I was preparing for this, one of the things that I learned was that a lot of Ambedkar's early influence on caste and land society was also influenced by John Dewey, who was also his professor at Columbia, who was trying to think through what does it mean, what is the relationship of the African Americans in this country to the land. What does it mean for their relationship to other communities that have been occupied, other communities whose lands have been occupied, and then a nation built on slavery? And I think those are some of the questions that I'm still learning to understand. But I think it's very important for us to always acknowledge that. Now, within that, there are communities that are for whom farming is the lifeline. And in some ways, understanding the past is a very essential way for us to think through what the future is. And one of the other things that was very surprising to me is that a lot of the temple documents are actually also documents of resistance. And one of the things that you consistently see is that people who are deprived of their rights have been resisting your kings, your local landlords, the coming of the British, the tilling of the land, how lands were supposed to be created. And I think understanding and excavating those stories of resistance is also very, very important for us. I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass it on to Aghilah.
Thank you. So like I said, I'm currently based in Indianapolis and work with the Kepler Institute. And before I go there, I just also want to echo very similar to what Suchitra had said. My family also comes from a farming agricultural background that then got migrated to Malaysia in the early 20th century. So we had occupied both statuses of landless and landed, and how both realities still exist. And I'll go into that later in the next more into it in the next question. So I'll root this conversation in my current reality and the history of the founders of the organization that I'm a part of, which is the Kepler Institute. So Kepler comes from an ancient Kemetic word meaning transformation. And our logo is a scarab beetle, which really reflects the work that we do of transformation of individuals and communities. And all three elders are Black, who with decades of rootedness in the community and approach to building resistance and providing spaces and building institutions for their community. And I actually currently live, the model of Kepler is that we are a communal space. The work and growth of Kepler is directly tied to a collective ownership and stewardship of resources, including land, including people, including whatever other resources, tangible and intangible, that exist in the space. Of course, there are structures that we have to abide by living in a settler colonial state that we are beholden to. But even within that, there's so much possibility for doing something different. So the house that I live in, actually, it's about 100 years old. And Imhotep and Pambana, who are married to each other when they were starting their family, were able to buy 3 properties on this block. and, had started cooperative businesses, had run cooperatives, food cooperatives out of this space in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and provided housing for young adults and youth who came through here. So I'm not the first or last person to stay in this space, which also doubles as a community space. The history of this community is always changing, but with actual, I'll put ownership in quotations, but stewardship and, the legal right, which is a very contentious space, they were able to create and cultivate a space that was safe within an incredibly violent society. Even the name of Indiana. So we actually don't have any like federally recognized nations in the state. The Miami don't have federal recognition, and therefore, what little protection they have, they don't. They operate as a 501c3, and so my personal practice is how do I donate resources to them, and looking at ways that, as someone who is also an immigrant to this land, reevaluating my relationship to lands back for me in Malaysia, in India, and here. And I think also the repositioning of self to our environment. I think we live and work in a society that, in a capitalist society that severs us from that. We are seen in domination over, ownership over, but not with. And it's a very hierarchical, dominant relationship that then ripples out into our relationships with each other as people, our relationships to resources, tangible, and just also spiritually. And that has been something that I've really understood as I've lived in this space. And we always have this concept and notion of like, we have to protect the entity that can't speak for itself. And for us, it's Kepra and the community, both the land and those who live on it, both human and not, that may not be able to be spoken for. And that's a duty that we have to be conscious of every single day, every moment. And so I'll leave it at that and move on to the next question.
Thanks, Aghilah. Thanks, everyone. So this next question is specifically for Suchitra. I'm putting it in the chat again. So what is the role, and you spoke to this a little bit, starting to talk about storytelling. What is the role of storytelling in crafting these movements and holding true the relationship between land and community? And I've just added this bit from kind of what I've heard. How do we navigate the complexities of identity, caste, and geographic differences of South Asia and our diasporic relationships to land and water? Kind of speaking to what you were talking about before in crafting accessible narratives and stories towards regenerative and sustainable futures. And that's for Suchitra.
Thank you. So there are multiple parts to this question, so I'm going to try and deconstruct each of them as successfully as I can manage. Storytelling remains important. And I say storytelling not as a way to convince the oppressor of our humanity, storytelling not as a way to convince institutions, systems that have consistently acted to erase the histories of violence, the histories of resistance. Increasingly, I see storytelling as an act of community. It's an act that we hold on to hold on to our sense of history and memory that is increasingly not only violated, but erased, and people have written about it. So I no longer see storytelling as a petition to the oppressor. For me, storytelling is an act of recording our histories. And some of those histories have connections. Some of them, while history and memory is local, those local histories and memories have transnational connections simply because of the nature of the world we live in, because of colonization, because of transatlantic slave trade, because occupation of Palestine and Kashmir, and what happens in Ferguson or what happens What happens in Alopecia's lands, it's being taken away to building large pipelines, are all connected. You cannot disconnect them. There is a line that connects all of that. Having said that, stories are also the most powerful way for us to position ourselves, but also make sense of our reality. And I'll take two examples from this. So from my own family history, I also spent about 8 years researching a book that recently came out. And one of the people that I speak to in the book, her great grandfather, so their history is that they are Kashmiris who migrate to Amritsar in Indian colonial India. And in Amritsar, Jallianwala Bagh, which is considered to be the moment that sparks another kind of resistance, her grandfather is killed. And that act of violence then leaves a young woman with 2 children, widowed. And then it starts not only one, but multiple acts of migration. And my friend then discovers this act of violence that happens to a great grandfather only in her 30s. And as she traces through the histories of violence, migration, the partition, sexual violence that the women in the family go through, all of it because of this one act of violence, she kind of begins to piece together these puzzles that never makes any sense for her. And as I was having that conversation with her, something else happened to me. I was talking to my mother recently, and my mother said that in the early 1930s, in 1936, there was a huge famine, which meant that a lot of the landowning communities, which might be also the story that Aghilah's family might have gone through, were displaced. These were Tamil and Telugu-speaking landowning communities from what is current-day Tamil Nadu who had to leave their lands after 7 years of famine because there was nothing to do. And in the act of migration from once what was the landowning community, you become landless. Some of them moved to the presidency of Madras, others moved to other parts like Bombay, anywhere. Some moved to Malaysia, some moved to Sri Lanka, some moved to Burma. So these once landowning, land-tilling communities were all of a sudden made landless, or land that they occupied was no longer worthy enough for them. So it was a moment of great disruption. And all of these years, I've never heard the figure of my grandmother because there's nothing about her except that she was a wonderful cook. All of a sudden in her 60s, my mother tells me a story of how in the moment of great crisis, my grandfather moves to the city, my mother is still not born, but of the 3 children that they already have, my grandfather rents a space and he's in debt. And he tells my grandmother that let's take our family and go kill ourselves because we are in debt, right? And my grandmother apparently told my grandfather that if you want to go kill yourself, please kill yourself. I am going to take care of my 3 children and I'm going to provide for them whatever it is. And it was that moment, again, it was a moment when I hadn't known about her act of resistance. And for me, then it becomes so much else becomes real. The way in which the women in the family are always guarded about the way they think about their relationship to money, their relationship to caste positions, how they feel. And I'm using these 2 examples, not to center myself, but to say that the moment we tell our stories, for me, the story is not a story of greater truth, but the story of how, if in that moment, if her act of resistance did not exist, I would not exist today. Her act of saying that you want to go kill yourself, please do, but I'm not going to do that. I'm sure that was not easy. This was 1930s India, colonial India. And yet, I think those stories are important. And over the years, many of the stories that I gathered, it becomes very clear to me, and it became very clear to me that the people whose stories we record are eloquent voices of their own oppression, of their resistance, of their histories. It's not that they don't have a voice, it's just that they don't need someone to give them a voice. The act of bearing witness, giving the voiceless a voice, all of that falls flat because then storytelling is not about convincing someone, but recording our own histories as a way to make sense of what is happening. And I think a lot of that gets lost. How do we navigate the complexities of identity, caste, geographic difference? Is that I go back to the idea of, for me, history and memory is very local. How caste works in rural Tamil Nadu is very different than how caste works in just a few kilometers up north. The ways our identities can get weaponized is also something that I want to acknowledge. We can all be people of color, but not all people of color come from all levels of privilege. And I think that's very important. Not everybody has the capacity to travel. Not everybody is called, not everybody has the capacity to travel, but also the ways in which our travel itself is criminalized. And I think those are all things that I think we should be very, very cognizant of. And I would try and not flatten these categories out, because those categories matter. A former child of a prime minister of the post-colonial nation is not the same as the child of a landless laborer who makes it to another country as an act of not only fleeing, but also an act of resistance. I think those are all things that one should be very careful. Yeah, and I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Suchitra. Aghilah, next question's for you. And kind of, you were starting to also speak to this. What histories of labor are you reminded of when you think about your work with Kepra and your own histories and your own, experiences? How does this translate to your work now?
Yeah, it's a beautiful segue, because that piece around the 1936 famine is what led to my family's migration to Malaysia. And that it was around the time that my maternal grandfather, he was not much older than I was when I immigrated here. During the colonial times. And so I think what it's interesting, I want to also, very much agree with what Suchitra said of like not flattening the experiences, and also recognizing how there are threads that connect us, both of violence and of healing. And some terms or like quotes that I'm like remembering from my elders is like, stolen land, stolen labor, stolen people, and how that is repeated across continents. So I'm going to connect that through my own experience and my family's experience. So both sides of my family, my maternal and paternal grandfathers, comes as Tamil migrant laborers under the Kangani system, or like a modified version of the indentured labor system. And my family were rubber estate workers. So they were tapping rubber in the estates. During colonial British times, also when Japan occupied Malaysia, and also post quote unquote independence in Malaysia. And both my parents were born on the estates and had spent a lot of their childhood and growing up on them. And continued until the 80s and 90s. So my father comes from the Lima Blessed estate in Perak. That was where he was born. And my mother and her family are from the Bahau estates in Malaysia. And so, similar to how Suchitra had spoken, my family had to figure out a way to survive. And that was to move to Malaysia and work on the rubber estates. But interestingly enough, as I had spoken to her earlier, we had gone from landed agriculturalists coming from a dominant caste in the Northwest, a region of Tamil Nadu, to being landless, marginalized communities in Malaysia, and still continue to today. That experience tied to that experience as landless laborers. And both exist at the same time, right? We have to look also tied to the piece around land. And as had said, I think it was by Harsha, of how ownership of land means that you're taking land from somebody else. And the way that translate that to today within a capitalist system of dominance is that we have gone from pre-colonial British systems, right, of land domination through the caste system that translates over to domination in a capitalist system. So that within that Northwest region, because of access to land and the potential for capital, whether you loan against it or sell it to gain financial capital, then led to the industrialization off the exploitation of Dalit Bahujan peoples and Adivasi peoples in that region that still continue to today, that translate into direct violence in that state, but then even also that region then becoming major supporters of the NDA, and within Tamil Nadu, supporters of the AIDMK coalition with BJP. And how that is really often hard to contend with when then oftentimes you also have the same experiences of marginalization across the seas. And it reminds me of a quote by Dr. Ambedkar, where wherever caste Hindu goes, he brings caste with him. And the dominant narrative, I think often, even amongst my generation, is that, you know, and even in Malaysia, they'll say, you know, caste isn't an issue. But if you take a closer look and you recognize and know what you're looking for, it still is very much alive. And then what happens is our access to capital, and then particularly within our position in the imperial core, then means that we're now directly funding and supporting violent systems back home in India. And so for me, my work and my history of labor, you know, is also very much informed by my maternal grandfather, who as a teenager and as a young adult became an atheist and a Periyarite during the Suyamariyade, or the self-respect movement, and was closely involved with the labor plantation workers union on the estates. And actually, if you were a Tamil person on an estate, you were automatically, you had to, because of survival, the need for a communal infrastructure, to be a part of the plantation workers union that supported community, that supported survival, and was pieces. So that there are ways that we can still continue those direct acts of resistance and solidarity for liberation. And then now, you know, the impetus for my parents migrating to the US was because, as a Tamil person in Malaysia, we just didn't have opportunities or access to opportunities, just to be like, you know, frank. And, you know, my father, despite being educated, wasn't getting any jobs, educated in the sense of like, you know, had a degree, right? And that's the narrative people feed us. Get a degree, go work, be better. And, you know, that was not a narrative that was, or an experience that was allowed from my parents. And so they decided, okay, there may be some opportunities in the US that we can go and do that. And so the expectations, even in my family, was that, you know, you do better than your family before you. But I'm gonna be honest, even for us and for others in my generation, I'm, I guess, like technically a millennial on the younger end, that's not realistic. But that's also within a frame of a capitalist mode of success, right? So for me, what is really critical and important is, how do I contribute to the liberation of peoples that I live with, that the lands that I occupy, through these paths of migration set up by white supremacy and capitalism, and even the caste system and caste hegemony in South Asia? And how do I work in direct resistance to that? And there's a multitude of ways of doing it. You know, for me, I'm doing this work with the Kepler Institute, being rooted and supporting the Black liberation struggle in Indiana, and then also trying to do that work in my personal life with family, and, you know, being on panels like this, trying to build with others in my community. And it's a journey. I'm still figuring out how to do that in a realistic way, and in a way that changes material conditions. And, you know, I think fundamentally it's the realization, and I've been journaling a lot, and like, you know, going through this, like, this tension between the both realities, right? Of how our communities and our people often live, we live with a noose, apologies for if it's triggering language, around our neck. We're struggling, we're like trying to make ends meet, we're trying to feed our kids, we're trying to feed our communities. But, in an attempt to get temporary relief, we're going to do that on the backs of others, on the subjugation of others, on the violence that we perpetuate against others. And instead of trying to cut that noose loose, we're just going to be okay with stepping on others' backs. And what the work is so important to do, whether it's through storytelling or it's through material and collective land ownership, and even the problematizing of the concept of redistribution and more towards how to return land, is hard work. Because while I'm on a Zoom meeting, the next hour I might be doing some yard work, and doing that with community and the importance of relationships within that. So I'm gonna stop there. Sorry rambling. So I'm gonna pass it over to Harsha.
Thanks, Aghilah. So thank you. And before you pass, I'm going to ask the question for Harsha. Harsha, thank you for being with us. So kind of a little bit of a transition, but continuing with this theme on land and land-based solidarity. So what does land-based solidarity across borders mean to you, and how have you seen it modeled? Do you think it's been repressed by the state, by corporations, by others? Just kind of what's your take on this? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for sharing your brilliant answers to your questions, Suchitra and Aghilah. It's wonderful to hear you both. I appreciate that question, and it's a tricky one because my first instinct is to actually say that I think ideas of land-based solidarity across borders has actually been weaponized. And I guess in this moment, I'm speaking from the context, as a Sikh person in the Pacific Northwest, where diaspora is deeply involved in the struggle of farmers back home. And at the same time, I think that solidarity has showed up in ways where there's an assumed or presumed kind of flattening or assumption that the struggle of farmers is, for example, very similar to that of oppressed peoples and indigenous peoples here on Turtle Island, in a way that, of course, obscures what it means to own land, right? And as we've been talking about. And so I think the relationship of land, and here I don't want to say South Asia. South Asia is a huge subcontinent, and I think even sometimes us homogenizing South Asia really collapses differences between the imperial core of India in that context, and what it means, in Bangladesh, in Burma, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, and elsewhere on the subcontinent. And also, of course, very much obscures the relationship of caste and class to land. And so for me, that's a hard one to answer, right? Because so much of what land-based relationships here means, which is in the context of people's lands been stolen, in the context of active occupation, in the context of enslavement, has often meant that diaspora, or I should say the Sikh diaspora, has claimed a solidarity and an affinity with land-based struggles that erases, again, Adivasi communities, that erases landless communities, that erases completely the relationship to class and caste, right? And that kind of romanticization of coming from a farming community, of being tied to the land, of course, begs the question, who's able to have a relationship to land in the North Indian context, for my context. So I think that's a tricky one in this moment, because I've actually been in a lot of debate and conversation about what the positioning is of Sikhs in particular, without, of course, erasing the reality that, coming from Punjab literally means coming from the land of 5 rivers, right? That there is a deep connection to land, that it is the agricultural basket of the country, that it has a relationship to the center that is written by exploitation of the Punjab, that is also written and underwritten by the counterinsurgency in Punjab that is ongoing, by the genocide of Sikhs in the 80s, which is in the Pacific Northwest, where a lot of the migration is refugee migration. It's not on terms of class migration or the kind of hand-selected diaspora of immigrants. It's refugee communities post-1980s where I currently live, right? So that is also part of that narrative. And at the same time, I think there's also the additional nuance in diaspora communities around what it means to be land-based that can also ignore the relationship to migrant work, right? So in the Pacific Northwest, where a lot of diaspora, and again here Sikh diaspora, claim a relationship to land as farmers, ignores the exploitation of a lot of farm owning, business owning Sikhs to Latino, Latinx, Black, African, and indigenous migrant farm workers, right? So these are muddied relationships when we kind of wear the mantle of being land-based sometimes. And here I'm speaking specifically because being land-based is so key, is such a key part of Sikh Punjabi identity in particular, that I think it has to be questioned in my context and our context, if anyone else comes from that context. That being said, I think there's an incredible amount of rethinking about what land means. And here, of course, that's under the leadership in India of the Zameen Prapti Sangharsh Committee, who are mostly Dalit Punjabis who have taken on the mantle of redistribution specifically in the Punjab. Punjab has one of the highest percentages of Dalit communities across India, over 30%. And spokespeople of landless laborers and industrial workers like Naldeep Kaur, right, who have made it very clear that the struggle against caste, class, capitalism, and colonialism is interconnected, right? We're all positioned differently within this, and the struggle is interconnected. And here I think the kind of the land-based solidarities that make sense to me are those that are, for example, fighting free trade agreements, right? Like where I'm based, Canada and India have a free trade agreement. That free trade agreement is literally exploiting the lands in Punjab. They're exploiting Adivasi lands across India. They're exploiting and stealing indigenous lands here. They impact workers' rights here, right? So those kinds of ways in which we can see the system operating through trade agreements, I think is one of the ways in which land-based solidarity works. And I think part of it is an expansive definition of what land means. And here, one example that I can give that I think may be unusual, but I think is resonant, is the relationship between indigenous people who have been forcibly disconnected from their land and Dalit folks. And so, years ago, so I'm part of a movement called No One is Illegal, which is a migrant justice movement that believes no one is illegal, right? That refuses the kind of idea of good immigrant, bad immigrant, refuses that division, and is focused on state violence. We were fighting the deportation of Lambar Singh, who was a landless Dalit Punjabi here in Vancouver. And as you can imagine, this was like a deeply contentious struggle in the South Asian community because he was not the quote unquote model minority, right? He was a landless laborer. He came with fake documents, did not have family here, did not have capital here, did not come from a farm owning community, and actually sustained a paralyzing disability. He became paralyzed working here in Canada, in Vancouver. And so also the ableist narrative of him no longer contributing to the Canadian economy. And so that was a huge struggle. This was a campaign for 3 years that we were engaged in with deep conversations in the community about what supporting Lambar Singh meant for our community, right? What it meant to take a stand against the Canadian state and against gatekeepers in our own community to say that this is someone we're going to fight for. And there's a long arc to this campaign that I won't go into. I encourage folks to look it up. But this is 15 years ago, before some of the direct actions that now take place in the United States, the blockades of docky buses. But the day he was about to be deported, over 3,000 people, and this probably won't surprise anybody, mostly BBGs and aunties, right? Mostly matriarchs in the community, showed up to physically prevent his deportation. It continues to be one of the most historic, unprecedented actions in North America in the community, right? Taking direct action, physically stopping border guards from deporting him. 2,000 people at 7 a.m. And after that deportation was stopped, there was many celebrations in the community, many debates in the community, around direct action, around defending him. But one moment that stood out to me was there was a Nishka elder from the Nishka Nation who was disconnected from his community because of residential schools, which in the US are called boarding schools. And he was then adopted out. He didn't feel like he had a connection to his land. He was an urban indigenous person. And it was this translated conversation that the two of them had for about 2 hours in the Gurdwara where he took sanctuary, where they were talking about what it means not only to have a relationship to land, but to actually have so much violence inflicted on you that you can no longer have a relationship with land, that I think holds the possibility of what a land-based solidarity looks right? Like to not assume that we're all even able to have a relationship with land because so many people have been disconnected from land. So I wanted to kind of subvert that question a little bit because I think, land-based, the idea that we have connections to land, particularly in the Sikh community, I think is often assumed in a way that erases such deep histories of violence, that I think the potential also rests in solidarity between landless people or people who've been forcibly disconnected from land. And I think both of those possibilities are immense, particularly if we're looking through it from a global perspective.
Wonderful. Thank you, Harsha. Thank you, everybody. That our time is running low. So we have just a final question for y'all, and I simplified it a little bit from what we'd planned in the interest of time. And I think take this as you will. What does a border-free and land-loving future look like to you? And really, what is the most radical, ambitious vision you can imagine in this moment for a future you'd like to see? And what's one thing we can do today to move towards that? And Harsha, if you want to start us off, and we'll kind of go backwards from there.
Big question. What is one thing it looks like? This might be the cliche answer, but I think for me, the border-free and land-loving future to me looks like a complete revolutionary transformation of the systems that we live in. And that it isn't simply about one of them, it really is about all of them. And it is about collective liberation, right? That there is no liberation for one of us, that it requires liberation for all people. It means rebuilding our relationship to the land. And I think maybe holding within that also, because I think a lot of times we think of revolutionary transformation as like the work that we humans need to do, which is of course a big part of it. But I think it does mean all of those intimate ways of finding a reconnection to the land, right? Like not in appropriative ways, but we have to be able to see ourselves as one part of the earth. I think as humans, we really are, we've gone so past our ability to think of our relationship to the land and other non-human species as anything that's not voyeuristic or extractive, that I think it's the deep humility of, literally learning how to be human again, and the humility of figuring out what our role is on this earth in relationship to the rest of living creatures, and to not always center humans within that. We have the most responsibility, of course, and some, of course, more than others, but to also think about non-human species within that.
Thank you so much, Harsha. Aghilah, would you like to close out?
Yeah. I wish I could just go be like, yeah, ditto what Harsha said. And I would add on to everything. What she said was that, I think a deep recognition of how our relationship with each other and to the land reflect in these larger systems. So if we're extractive with each other, just on a human to human level, we're extractive to the land and vice versa. And goes back to the point of just radically reimagining ourselves to it. And I think community is really important in that. And a community that's not rooted in like systems of power and division, but a real recognition that of how we are all deeply tied to each other. And yeah, just be find ways in your in your space in whatever city that you're in, and it doesn't have to be big. I think people often think that they alone have to be the one that changes the system, but nothing ever happens by oneself. And even the systems of nature and the world doesn't happen on its own. They're all interconnected. So I'll pass it over to Suchitra.
Yeah, I would start by saying that everybody should get Arsha's book on border and rule. I think she answers that question. I know she's far too humble and polite to say it, but I think there are some powerful arguments that Harsha makes in the book. And I think one of the things that we really need to acknowledge is that borders make unequal people. They make unequal people not by mistake, not as history's deceit or malice. These are very functional laws, rules, systems, and not to mention a capitalistic system invested in maintaining these. And one of the things that we should also acknowledge is that the challenge to that militarized, bordered world is already here. It is here as, I mean, this is here as if COVID has shown us anything. It's shown us how deeply flawed these systems are. And in response to COVID and the way in which various states, whether it's the United States, whether it's Europe, Britain, India, have dealt with it, it shows how deeply flawed the nation state as a system of governance is. Having said that, we have to acknowledge that climate change will fundamentally remake the world. 20 million people are already, I hate this phrase, but climate change refugees. I mean, they're not climate change refugees. These are people whose statelessness or lack of land has been manufactured by a very specific kind of carceral capitalistic state. And there are going to be more land that is going to be swallowed by the ocean. What standing army would you put in place to guard your borders when ocean swallows them up? Second, you also see the ways in which people are already responding to the crisis. They're already, whether it's your mutual aid, the way in which people are resisting, people making their own maps, whether maps of belonging, maps of memory, maps of histories, that is already happening. And one of the things that is very interesting for me, which is a failed experiment of a different kind of democracy, it's also what happened in Rojava in Syria, where a community, it's in all its imperfection, people are already trying to imagine new ways of what it means to constitute ourselves. And that constitution of freedom and dignity does not have to be tied to the idea of rights that a constitution gives us. The idea that individuals have dignity and freedom and rights should be fundamental, not tied to a constitution and not be tied to a state that grants us these rights or these and then enforces duties and responsibilities in relationship to that. I think that world is already here. And we're also in a moment of great crisis, and crisis is often remade the world in many ways than just institutional change. And I think that goes back to the idea that we cannot keep thinking about institutional change. This system cannot exist. You need to dismantle it. And that is not even radical. That is not even utopian. That is what we need to do to survive what the future brings for us. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, Suchitra, Harsha, Aghilah, everyone on. I really appreciate the bringing in the climate justice angle. I live in a place and come from my people are from Bangladesh, so our lands are sinking into the waters faster than anywhere on the planet, both where I live and where I'm from. So, and with that, today is summer solstice. So I just want to invite us as we close to just take a breath and connect to the land you're on and think of the land you're from. This is a day, in our cycles of the earth that is special. So we did schedule this with that intention. So I just wanted to connect us to that intention that we scheduled this today for. And with that, pass it to Shruti to close us out. Thank you all so much.
All right. Hi, folks. Thank you again, Jayeesha, for facilitating, Harsha, Aghilah, Suchitra, for being with us today. I think, this is kind of the work that we at SALT are trying to lay out now, or how we can, as communities that maybe have differing relationships, right, with not just the land that we're on, but the land that we're from, how we can better understand and build those connections. And, the next and final part of this mini series, we're going to have Lisa Doi from Turu for Solidarity and Professor Samina Raja from Stand with Kashmir, kind of talking about really reclaiming relationships to land and being in a communal collective process of healing and what that can look like, whether that's, you know, showing up and being in action around deportations or in resisting and affirming the actual violence that happened in, I think they're called residential schools in Canada or boarding schools here in the States, and with spaces across the country, really building that language. And so I invite y'all to kind of keep updated on what's going on. I'll be sharing resources. And one last moment of thanks for each of us and for each of y'all for being here, and looking forward to next conversation. All right. Thanks, folks.